Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 66, The Mongol Western Campaigns Part 1, The Fall of Bulgaria. Before we begin, thank you to New Boyar Ed and to all of you subscribing through Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you also to anyone who joined us at Intelligent Speech this weekend. There were some great presentations. So, as we concluded last time, contrary to popular myth, the Mongols' first incursion into the West and encounters with the Rus and Bulgars were far from encouraging for them. They were not invincible, and it was not inevitable that they would win. The intelligence that Jochi and Subutai brought back was clear, that any attempt to conquer the West would require serious resources and preparation, and, for a while at least, they were not available. The Mongols had already acquired large territories in Central Asia and Siberia that required proper subjugation and taxation. The peoples that had been brought into their empire were required to provide troops for the Mongol armies, and that meant that they had to be organized and trained to operate with them. And back in the east, their campaign in China had also struggled. Within the domain that he had been given, Jochi had to spend time on the Merkits, Naimans, Karaites, Kipchaks, Kangli, and other conquered peoples of his Ulus, who had to be divided into thousands and integrated into his armies. Despite all this work, plans were being made for a new campaign in the southern Urals. However, even as preparations began, news came of a rebellion by the Tangut people of Western Xia at the eastern end of the Silk Road, which escalated into an all-out war, requiring troops to be diverted there instead. According to Rashid al-Din, the Persian Jewish vizier of the Ilkhanate, Ulus of Hulagu, that would rule Iran and the surrounding territories, our most important source on the Mongol Empire, before he returned to the east to deal with the Tanguts, Chingis Khan had ordered Jochi to start conquering the rest of the Deshti Kipchak, the Bashkorts, Cherkess, and other peoples. When Jochi showed no sign of following through on these orders, Chingis read this as defiance, and relations between them soured. Chingis summoned Jochi to explain himself, but Jochi claimed that he was too ill to travel to meet him. Soon after this, things got worse when one of his men let slip that he was actually out hunting instead of sick in his bed. Chingis decided that Jochi was in revolt and ordered his other sons, Chagatai and Ogadai, to start a campaign against him. They would lead an advance force and he would follow on himself once he had dealt with the Xia. Before it came to battle, word came that Jochi was dead. The true cause remains a mystery, but rumor had it that he was indeed unhappy with his father's policies and had been poisoned by members of his court who had turned against him. 6 months later, Chingis Khan was also dead. Rashid al-Din and the Yuan Shi say that he died from an illness, which various historians have argued was malaria, typhus, or the bubonic plague. As the Mongols were still laying siege to Zhongxing, the Xia capital, His death was kept secret, which led to numerous legends appearing as to how he was killed by an arrow, by lightning, or by a captive concubine. In 1229, after 2 years of sometimes heated negotiations and scheming, the Kurultai approved Ogedei as the new Great Khan, and Jochi's son Batu as the ruler of the Ulus of Jochi. The various deals included a reapportioning of the territories belonging to the sons of Chingis. The Jochids had been strong supporters of Ogedei, so even though Batu lost the rights to the Altai Mountains and some of the southern Siberian forest peoples that Jochi had conquered, he was confirmed in the rest of the Ulus, and any new land he conquered in the west, which made his appanage seem potentially almost limitless. The Kurultai also confirmed Chingis' previous orders to conquer the territory north of the Kipchaks, and allocated Batu and his brothers 30,000 men led by Kuktai and Subutai. And so, with power secured and reinforcements for his troops, Batu turned his attention to the lower Volga. We have very limited information on this campaign, other than it did not go well. The main center of resistance was a city called Saksin, the center of a province of the same name, which archaeologists have identified with a site near the village of Samodelka in the Volga Delta. Saksin was primarily inhabited by Bulgars and Suvars, and probably acknowledged the ruler of Volga Bulgaria as overlord. The return of the Mongols was not entirely a surprise to the people of the Western Steppe, and Saksin had become the leader of a loose alliance with the nomadic peoples of the region, Yemek Kipchaks, Alans, and Magyars. They also appear to have been supported by a Bulgar expeditionary force. According to the Laurentian Chronicle, which could have received its information from Bulgars who sought refuge in Susdalia after the conquest of Bulgaria, the Saksins, Bulgars, and Polovtsians fought the Tatars near the river Yaik. The Bulgar army returned home beaten. Arab sources tell us only that there was a war on the southern Volga. Friar Julian, a Hungarian monk travelling east in search of the Magyars who had stayed in their homeland, Giovanni del Pian de Carpini, and William of Rubric provide us with a little more information. They all managed to mix up Saksin and Saxony, which, given that there were two Bulgarias, is maybe not such a silly error, but the impression of fierce resistance to the Mongols is clear. Giovanni writes that the Mongols laid siege to Saksin and tried to conquer them. The Mongols brought up machines, but the Saksins had their own and broke the Mongols' machines. The defenders' ballistae made it impossible for the Mongols to approach the city. Eventually, the Mongols were forced to dig an underground road into the city. They sent in teams divided between those who were fighting and those who were to set fires through the city. The defenders also divided into those who fought the men and those who fought the fires. Their bravery drove the Mongols back, and they were forced to abandon the siege. According to William of Rubric, it took 8 years of attacks before the Mongols took the city. Friar Julian states that the first attack began in 1229 and he found out that the city had fallen after several years of fighting only in 1237. These sources don't refer to the Bulgars joining the Saxons as the Rus Chronicle records, but it would make sense if they had done. This would be notable as the only long-range Bulgar campaign that we know of. As previously mentioned, although they were a strong regional power, the Bulgars had primarily followed a defensive policy throughout their history. Even their campaigns against the Rus had only been into immediately neighboring territories. So Batu's initial campaign against Saksin had failed, and the Ulus of Jochi withdrew to regroup. The next campaign came in the summer of 1232. This time, the target was Bulgaria itself. We have even less information about this campaign, just a couple of brief lines in the Laurentian Chronicle. The Tartars came and stayed through the winter without reaching the great city of Bulgaria. We can take the absence of other sources on the Mongol side as support for the Rus record that the Mongols aimed to take out the Bulgar capital but failed to reach it, and this campaign was also a failure. So I think it's fair to say that although there is a popular image of the Mongols rolling through Eastern Europe like a steamroller, here we are 11 years into their Western campaigns, 5 years into their second invasion of the West, and they have so far achieved nothing. As the Secret History of the Mongols puts it, quote, Subutai Bagatur met with powerful resistance from the peoples and cities he had been assigned to conquer, as well as the cities beyond the deep rivers Atil and Jaya. There are many hostile countries there, and the people are fierce. End quote. The Jochid leadership was unhappy and at a loss where to go next. They appealed to Ogedei, and thanks to the Jochids' firm support for him as Great Khan, he was receptive, despite already dealing with ongoing simultaneous campaigns in Korea, Tibet, and against the southern Song. Ogedei once again assigned Subutai and his troops to Batu, but it was already clear that this was not enough by itself. In 1235 he called a new Kurultai and proclaimed that all Mongols would participate in a Western campaign led by Batu. The Persian historian Juwayni, who had access to the documents in the Khan's chancellery, wrote, quote, Ogedei Khan gathered the great Kurultai for a second time. They met to discuss the extermination and subjugation of those who had not been conquered. They resolved to conquer the land of the Bulgars, the Ases, and the Ruses, which lay in Batu's camp. They had not been subordinated and took vain pride in the large number of their cities. End quote. Ogedei ordered the levying of additional taxes to fund the campaign, and that each family send its eldest son to join the army. It was the biggest mobilization the Mongol Empire had yet seen. Chingis Khan's youngest son, Kulkan, Ogedei's own sons, Tului and Chagatai's sons, and all the adult Jochids, Batu, Orda, Shiban, and Tangut joined, along with Subutai, Barandai, and several other famous generals. The size of this army has been the subject of controversy over the years. In the traditional Russian imperial historiography, it became an article of faith that the Mongol conquest was entirely a matter of dominance through sheer numerical advantage. Karamzin put the size of Batu's army at 500,000 men and stated his position unambiguously, quote, "Batu's forces were superior to ours beyond comparison, and this was the only reason for his success." End quote. Solovyov concluded that Batu had 300,000 men, and that bracket of 300,000 to 500,000 became widely accepted among Russian historians. Of course, neither figure is close to realistic, and 20th century historians tried to form a better estimate. A good starting point was to assume that each of the 12 to 14 Chingisids named as participating could have had their own 10,000, which in theory was the amount of troops assigned to each. So somewhere between 120 and 140,000. A similar figure is reached if we take the estimated Mongolian population and use that order to provide one warrior from each family as the basis for our calculations. We also have some numbers from contemporary sources. A Mongolian register that puts the army at 129,000, while the secret history tells us that it was 95,000. This range of around 100 to 120,000 has become widely accepted. Jack Wilson mentioned a similar number a few episodes back, but there are some historians who have argued against it and in favor of an even smaller force, including Vernadsky and Gumilyov, who favor an army of around 50,000 and claim that any larger number is simply impossible. For context, we need to remember that although the ancient world had seen massive armies, the armies of medieval Europe had become much smaller. It was a rare ruler who could put more than 20,000 men in the field, especially if we're talking about trained soldiers rather than a simple militia. Half of that was considered a large army. We've already discussed the biggest armies the rulers of Bulgaria and Rus could theoretically field. But we should also note that they never actually did gather these forces. The coalition that Vladimir Monomach assembled for his campaign into the steppe was probably the largest Rus army ever. We should also not forget that Batu's army was not entirely Mongol. He had large contingents of Kipchaks and other conquered peoples under his command, so we should not base our estimates strictly on what the Mongols alone could provide. However, although the full Mongol force of 100 to 120,000 would indeed have had overwhelming numerical superiority, there was never any battle in which the full force participated. Instead, this force was divided into separate armies under various commanders, which deployed in various directions. A part of the army was dispatched towards the Caucasus before the assault on Bulgaria even began, and once Bulgaria was beaten, it was divided again. This means that it is indeed possible to suggest, along with some historians, that there were approximately equal opposing forces when the Mongols go on to fight Yuri of Susdalia, for instance. But it also means that it was not possible for the Rus to form defensive alliances and field combined armies. The Mongols invaded across a broad front with the threat coming from different directions, and all the Rus knyazes had to deal with them individually. Subutai, second in command to Batu, started the campaign by attacking and defeating the Yemeks even before the whole army had gathered. The remaining Yemeks retreated beyond the Volga, and the Mongols could prepare for their attack on Bulgaria with their southern flank secure. Meanwhile, Batu was suppressing the Magyar tribes in the southern Cis-Ural region. The full Mongol army was assembled in the Volga region in the late summer of 1236. Friar Julian encountered a Mongol emissary who told him that the army was so big it could be split into 40 separate forces, which would still be capable of beating anyone they found in their way. This may have been an example of another Mongol ploy, spreading rumors of their power and invincibility to demoralize their enemies. Unlike the Rus, who, as far as we can tell, did not expect any threat from the Mongols after the battle on the Khalkha and did not make any preparations, the Bulgars had been preparing. Bila had 5 kilometers of wall surrounding the inner city, another ring of ramparts and trenches, and a 10-kilometer outer wall. The archaeological evidence shows that it was reinforced at this time, and that fortifications across the region were built or rebuilt wherever there were towns to defend. The Mongols advanced rapidly on Bila in the early autumn. They may have taken the Bulgars by surprise. Autumn was not usually part of the campaign season, as the rains turned the countryside to mud. It was also possible that the Bulgars may have released some of the capital's garrison or any army they had gathered to help with the harvest at home. The Mongols converged on Bila from several directions and quickly established a siege. Giovanni da Pianda Grappini described their tactics as follows, quote, "When they come across a fortress, they surround it. Sometimes they fence it in so no one can enter or leave. They fight with weapons and arrows bravely without stopping for a single day or night. So those in the fortress cannot rest. The Mongols rest because they split their troops, so some rest while the others are in the battle, and they do not grow tired. If they fail to take the fortress this way, they throw wildfire at it, undermine the fortifications, and enter with arms from under the ground. When they have entered, one part throws fire, and the rest fight against the people of the fortress." End quote. Whether it was simple numerical superiority, or that the Bulgars were caught off guard and unprepared, or something else that made this attack different to the previous decade of attempts, this time the Mongol victory was swift. The result for Bila, the great city of the Bulgars, the largest city in Eastern Europe, was disastrous. According to the Laurentian Chronicle, quote, "In the year 1236, the godless Tartars came to the Bulgar land from the eastern countries and conquered the great city of the Bulgars. They killed everyone with their weapons, old and young. They took a great amount of goods and set their city on fire. They captured their entire land." End quote. Duane wrote much the same from the Mongol viewpoint. First, the princes conquered Bulgar, which is famous throughout the world as unapproachable and having a large population. They took it by storm, killed part of the citizens, and captured the rest. End quote. Archaeologists have confirmed what we find in these records. Bila, a city of as many as 100,000 inhabitants, was reduced to ruins, left desolate, and completely depopulated. The entire area where the city stood shows traces of destruction by fire. Human remains are scattered across it, along with mass graves. The destruction of Bila knocked out large-scale resistance among the Bulgars, but did not mean that they went down easily. Friar Julian was told a year later that Bulgaria had fallen and the Mongols had captured 60 fortresses. and many of the sites across the region show signs of battle at those fortresses. We can take the fact that it would be another year before the Mongols were ready to move against the Rus as evidence for the effort required to subjugate the Bulgars. A couple of Bulgar nobles, Bayan and Jiku, went over to the Mongols with their followers. Elsewhere, resistance was fierce, and, as was the Mongol practice, those who resisted instead of surrendering were destroyed. Archaeological sites across Bulgaria show complete destruction and the slaughter of the population. In 1237, the Mongols crossed the Volga at the Samara Bend and destroyed the southern Bulgarian towns. They continued south towards Zolotaryov, where the Bulgars had defeated Subutai almost 15 years earlier. Across the region, the archaeological remains show devastated towns that were never rebuilt, burned to the ground with piles of human remains, suggesting that whole populations were simply killed. The destruction is so severe and complete that some historians have interpreted it as a revenge for that previous defeat. They continued from there to suppress the Bulgars' Mordvin tributaries. Without the Bulgars to unite and defend them, most of the tribal leaders surrendered to the Mongols and acknowledged them as their overlords. Almost 500 years since it first formed, the destruction of Bulgaria was total. There would still be people called Bulgars, but there would be no more Bulgaria on the Volga. Their cities were gone and would not be rebuilt. Their records and literature were destroyed so thoroughly that they have never been found. The Bulgars would be fully incorporated into the Ulus of Jochi. They will combine with other Turkic peoples in the Ulus to re-emerge as Mongol rule disintegrated, with a different language, but still a distinct identity. Today's Volga Tatars still look to the Bulgars as one of the foundational elements of their people and culture. Next, the Mongol army headed towards the Sura River, continuing to suppress pockets of resistance as they went. According to Rashad al-Din, with the fall of Bulgaria, its vassal Mordvin princes became subjects of their new rulers as a matter of course. Batu sent some of his men back east to rest for several months, and then the army reassembled at a place called Nuzla, not far from modern-day Voronezh. After conferring with his generals, their plan of action was decided. The army was divided into four and turned towards the northwest. Messengers galloped ahead of them, past trains of Bulgar refugees, towards the knyazes of Suzdal, Ryazan, Murom, and Pronsk, to deliver Batu's ultimatum: surrender or be destroyed as Bulgaria had been destroyed. Join me next episode as the Mongols begin their assault on Rus. Thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.